In 1998, one company spent millions of dollars lobbying the United States Congress. The subject wasn't trade policy, it wasn't taxes, it was a single cartoon character, and whether that character's copyright was about to expire. That company was Disney. And the fight over that one character is really a fight about something bigger: how a business protects an asset it never had to pay for in the first place. 6 of Disney's most valuable early films were never licensed from an author, an estate, or a studio. The source material cost the company nothing, $0 in acquisition. That's not an accident, it's a strategy, and it's the reason this entire story exists. Over the next 20 minutes, we'll walk through that strategy from the beginning: how it was built, how one small charity in London fought the same battle from the opposite side, how Disney defended its own version in Congress and the Supreme Court, and what happens now that the mechanism that built the empire is starting to take it apart. Every piece of intellectual property has a lifespan. Under U.S. law, once that lifespan ends, the work becomes public domain, meaning no single company or individual owns it anymore. It's available to anyone at zero cost. Cinderella was published by French author Charles Perrault in 1697. Snow White and Sleeping Beauty came from the Brothers Grimm in the early 1800s. The Little Mermaid was written by Hans Christian Andersen in 1837. None of these works were ever under Disney's control. The pattern didn't stop with the early fairy tales. The Jungle Book came from Rudyard Kipling, published in 1894. The Hunchback of Notre Dame came from Victor Hugo in 1831. Beauty and the Beast traces back to a French story published in 1740. Tarzan, by contrast, is a rare exception. It entered U.S. public domain only in 1962, and Disney licensed it rather than adapting it for free. From a balance sheet perspective, that distinction matters. Disney's actual capital went into production, animation, marketing, and distribution. In most cases, the raw material, the story itself, was free. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, released in 1937, is widely credited as the first full-length animated feature film in American cinema. It became the foundation of Disney's entire film division. The underlying story had already been public property for over a century. This wasn't a one-time move. It became a repeatable model, applied across more than half a century of releases, all built on stories no company owned outright. Which raises the obvious question: if the underlying story can't be owned by anyone, what exactly does a studio walk away with? The answer is what copyright law calls original expression, not the idea, not the plot, the specific, tangible way a company brings that idea to life. A servant girl attending a ball and losing a glass slipper, that's public domain. The specific blue gown, the exact character design, the named mice, the songs written for the film, that's proprietary. That's the line. That's also why, in 1998, 20th Century Fox was able to release its own Cinderella film, Ever After, starring Drew Barrymore, without paying Disney a licensing fee or facing legal action. The underlying property was never Disney's to license. Same logic applies to The Little Mermaid. The 1837 source material never specifies red hair, a purple top, or the name Ariel. Disney created those specific details in 1989. That combination is protected. The underlying folktale is not. In business terms, this is a moat. Disney couldn't stop a competitor from making another Cinderella. But it could, and did, build enough proprietary detail into its own version that competing directly with it became commercially difficult. That moat became one of the most valuable intangible asset bases in entertainment history, which is exactly why decades later, protecting it became a legislative priority, not just a legal one. Before we get to Disney's own legislative fight, it's worth looking at a very different case that shows this mechanism isn't only used by large corporations. In 1929, playwright J. M. Barrie gave the rights to Peter Pan to Great Ormond Street Hospital, a children's hospital in London. Every licensed staging, publication, or broadcast of the story sent royalty income directly to the hospital. Under standard UK copyright law, that protection was scheduled to expire in 1987, 50 years after Barry's death, which would have cut off the hospital's income entirely. In 1988, the UK Parliament passed a special provision granting the hospital a perpetual right to royalties from Peter Pan, specifically within the UK, an arrangement copyright scholars widely consider unique in modern law. The mechanism is nearly identical to what Disney would pursue a decade later, using legislation to prevent a valuable income-generating property from lapsing into the public domain. The difference is who benefited. In this case, a hospital, not a media conglomerate. That precedent is useful context. By the time Disney's own deadline arrived, the idea of legislating around an expiring copyright wasn't unprecedented. It had already been done, just not at this scale, and not for this kind of company. By the mid-1990s, a specific deadline was approaching. Mickey Mouse's earliest copyrighted appearance, the 1928 short film Steamboat Willie, was scheduled to enter the public domain in 2003. For a company whose brand identity is built around that character, this wasn't a minor licensing issue. It was a direct risk to the corporate logo itself. Disney responded the way large companies typically respond to a legislative risk. It lobbied. Alongside other major rights holders, including Time Warner, Universal, and the estates of composers like George Gershwin, Disney pushed for a copyright term extension. Reporting at the time put Disney's lobbying spend on this specific effort at roughly $6.3 million. Some copyright scholars have since pushed back on how much credit, or blame, belongs to Disney alone, since multiple major rights holders backed the same bill. Publicly, the case for the bill was framed around international alignment. The European Union had already standardized on a copyright term of the author's life plus 70 years, and supporters argued U.S. law was falling out of step. Whatever the mix of motives, the campaign succeeded. Congress passed the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act. President Bill Clinton signed it on October 27, 1998. The law added 20 years of protection to corporate-owned works, extending the term from 75 years to 95 years from publication. Critics gave the law an unofficial nickname almost immediately, the Mickey Mouse Protection Act. The timing, relative to Steamboat Willie's expiration date, was difficult to ignore. The effect extended well beyond Mickey Mouse. For 20 straight years starting in 1998, no work in the United States lost copyright protection due to natural expiration. The public domain simply stopped growing across every industry the law touched, books, music, and film alike. Supporters argued the extension aligned U.S. law with the international standards and protected continued investment in creative industries. Opponents argued the law protected works that had already been made decades earlier, with no new creative incentive involved at all. The law was challenged and taken to the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Eldred v. Ashcroft. The plaintiffs argued the extension violated the Constitution's requirement that copyright protection be for limited times. In 2003, the court disagreed and upheld the extension. The ruling bought the company roughly 2 more decades of protection on its earliest assets, but a legislative win doesn't remove the underlying mechanism. It only resets the clock. On January 1, 2024, that extended clock finally ran out. The original 1928 version of Mickey Mouse legally entered the public domain. 95 years of protection, 1 major legislative campaign, 1 Supreme Court case, and in the end, the term still expired. Which raises the next question for this case study. What actually happens commercially the moment a company's asset stops being exclusive? The market responded almost immediately. Within weeks of the expiration, independent filmmakers announced a horror film using the 1928 version of Mickey Mouse as a central character. No license was required and none was requested. The economics here are part of the story too. Independent horror productions are typically made on comparatively small budgets. A recognizable character entering the public domain removes the single largest cost such a production would otherwise face, the licensing fee. That's a meaningful incentive for smaller studios to move quickly once a character's protection lapses. It's important to be precise here. Only that specific 1928 design entered the public domain. The modern colorized version, the one used in current branding, merchandise, and park operations, remains fully protected. This wasn't a first for the industry either. In 2022, the same mechanism applied to Winnie the Pooh and Bambi when their earliest copyrighted versions expired 2 years ahead of Mickey's. In both cases, the pattern was identical. A character central to a major media company's brand became legally available to independent producers who moved into that gap almost immediately. But losing copyright protection doesn't mean a company loses all legal leverage over a character. A second separate protection remains in place: trademark. Unlike copyright, trademark protection doesn't run on a fixed timer. It can continue indefinitely as long as the mark is still actively used to identify a company's goods or services in the marketplace. So an independent studio can legally use the 1928 Mickey design. What it cannot do is imply through marketing or branding that the production is affiliated with or endorsed by Disney. That crosses from copyright into trademark law, a separate legal claim entirely. This is the strategic pivot worth noting. As copyright protection on the company's earliest assets expires, its practical control increasingly depends on trademark law and brand enforcement, rather than the underlying character rights themselves. In other words, the asset doesn't disappear, it changes categories from an exclusive right the company controls outright to a brand identity it has to actively defend, character by character, as each one exits copyright protection on schedule. Looked at purely as a cost-benefit exercise, the 1998 campaign delayed the inevitable by 2 decades for a lobbying spend in the low single-digit millions. Whether that was a good trade depends entirely on how much 20 additional years of exclusive control over Mickey Mouse was worth to the company, a number Disney has never publicly disclosed. So the natural next question from a forward-looking standpoint is what else is scheduled to follow the same path. Under current U.S. law, corporate works are protected for 95 years from publication. Pinocchio and Fantasia, both from 1940, are due in 2036. Dumbo follows in 2037 and Bambi's film in 2038. Cinderella isn't due until 2046, Alice in Wonderland in 2047, and Peter Pan's American copyright, separate from the UK's perpetual royalty arrangement, holds until 2049. There's one variable that could change this timeline, another legislative extension, similar to what happened in 1998. Given the company's lobbying history, that's a realistic possibility, not a remote one. But absent new legislation, the trajectory is fairly clear. Copyright exclusivity on this portfolio declines steadily over the coming decades. Trademark control remains the more durable, if narrower, form of protection left standing. The company that built its earliest, most valuable assets using free public domain material is now, on a fixed and public schedule, returning pieces of its own portfolio to that same public domain. As a case study, this isn't really a story about one cartoon mouse. It's a story about how intellectual property functions as a corporate asset, one with an acquisition cost, a defense strategy, and in this case, a legally guaranteed expiration date. Acquired for free, defended through legislation and litigation, now managed through trademark law on a fixed and public timeline. The next major date on that timeline is 2036, when Pinocchio is scheduled to follow the same path Mickey Mouse did in 2024. What that transition tends to look like in practice is worth its own case study. Subscribe for the next one in this series.